My name is John Burkhalter. I'm a member of the board of the Princeton Adult School, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker this evening, Mark Weisinger. Mark Weisinger is professor of politics at Princeton University and director of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. He previously served on the faculties of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Harvard University. From 1992 to 1998, Professor Weisinger was the founding director of Wisconsin's Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. And from 2001 to 2004, was chair of Wisconsin's Political Science Department. He has also served as president of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies and as vice chair of the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research. Professor Weisinger's main fields of interest are social movements, revolutions, nationalism and ethnic politics, and imperialism, with special reference to the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet states. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, he is author or editor of 4 books: Scientific Management, Socialist Discipline and Soviet Power from Harvard University Press, The Nationalist Factor in Soviet Politics and Society, Westview Press, Beyond State Crisis, Post-Colonial Africa and Post-Soviet Eurasia Compared, Johns Hopkins University Press, and Nationalist Mobilization and the Collapse of the Soviet State, University Press of Cambridge, England. The latter work won the 2003 Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award presented by the American Political Science Association for the best book published in the United States in the field of government, politics, or international affairs, as well as the 2003 Matai Dogan Award presented by the Society for Comparative Research for the best book published in the field of comparative research. Professor Weisinger's recent writings have dealt with such issues as the spread of colored revolutions in the post-communist region, the relationship between ethnicity and democratization, nonviolent civil resistance movements, the persistence of empire as a category of politics in Eurasia, historical legacies of communism, revolutionary coalitions, and the changing relationships between violence and revolution. His research has been supported by the Institute for Advanced Study here at Princeton, the Wissenschaftliche zu Berlin, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the National Science Foundation, the United States Institute for Peace, and the Ford, Rockefeller, and Olin Foundations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Mark Weisinger.
Thank you, John, and I'd say it's a pleasure to speak to many of my neighbors here in Princeton. It's a little intimidating being down here at the bottom of the pit rather than looking down at you, but I guess I'll get used to it over the next talk. The title of my talk is Putin 2.0. Basically, it's an assessment of Vladimir Putin's second presidency, what it's meant for Russia, for Russian society, what it's meant for the rest of the world. And I know this lecture series has been entitled Cold Facts About Hot Spots, but you can reverse that and call this lecture Hot Facts About Cold Spots. So, Vladimir Putin has now been the most powerful figure in Russia for, 13 years, since the year 2000. Even during the Medvedev interlude, when Dmitry Medvedev became president, and Putin became the prime minister. And this was due to the two-term limit that there was for the Russian president in the Russian constitution. Putin still exercised the predominant power from behind the scenes within the Russian state. Excuse me. Indeed, in September 2011, he embarrassingly forced Medvedev not to seek a second term as president, instead to step down so that he could become president once again and occupy that office. The Russian constitution forbids more than 2 consecutive terms in office of the president. And it doesn't forbid the same person from taking a little vacation for 4 years and then coming back and doing another 2 consecutive terms. And given that the Russian presidential term has now been conveniently extended to 6 years rather than 4 years, we likely will have Mr. Putin, assuming that he's elected again, which is a pretty good bet, that he will be president until 2024. Now, by that time, he'll be 72 years old. And among the modern rulers of Russia, only Stalin will have run Russia for a longer period of time than Putin. Of course, theoretically, there's nothing to stop him from arranging another interlude, and with Medvedev or with somebody else, so that he could, in fact, hold the presidency until he dies. In fact, the Russian joke that's made the rounds in Russia over the recent years has Putin and Medvedev waking up at Putin's dacha in the morning sometime in 2023, and Putin says to Medvedev, he says, "Oi, Dima, my head is killing me. Do you remember which one of us is president?" And Medvedev says, "No, I don't remember, but what does it matter anyway? You be president and I'll be prime minister." And Putin replies, "Well, good, then you go out and get the beer." Which is a reference to how Russians typically get over a state of drunkenness. They go out and get beer in the morning. Drink a little bit more. There's actually a Russian word for that. But despite Russians' insatiable appetite for political humor, Putin 2.0 is no laughing matter. So Putin was inaugurated as president in May 2012. Since then, he's been busy engaging in what Human Rights Watch has called the worst human rights crackdown in Russia since Soviet days. In June 2012, let me just go through a listing of what he's done here. In June 2012, new restrictive laws on public protest were enacted that raised the fines for protesting without a license from $65 to $9,000. Now that's in a society in which the median income is $10,000 a year. So you can, if you don't get a license to protest, you can sacrifice your yearly income. And it's also a country that's not known for giving out licenses to protest very easily. In July 2012, a month later, a law was passed that forced NGOs that engage in advocacy work and receive foreign funding to register as, quote, foreign agents. A move aimed at scaring the public from having anything to do with them. The law mandated that NGOs that are registered as foreign agents must list on their websites that fact that they are a foreign agent, and they must, in any public discourse, also note that fact. All official communications. Also that same month, July 2012, and I should say, he was only sworn in as president in May 2012, so this is kind of like the 100 days, only stepping backwards, I guess you could say. In July 2012, defamation was reintroduced as a criminal offense in Russia, with fines of up to $61,000 for producing defamatory public statements. And that's, I say, it's not a civil case. This is something that the police can bring. It's a criminal case. So changes were also introduced at the time that increased internet censorship and curbed freedom of expression. This was supposedly done in the name of censoring child pornography. But what the law did was it provided judges with incredible leeway, wide-ranging powers to censor the internet for for any reason, if they were so to decide. And in fact, we've seen, particularly in recent days, a few instances in which they have actually censored the internet. Not a lot, it's still largely uncensored, but a few. Usually, you know, the purpose of many of these laws is more to scare people than to actually have to enforce them. So in September 2012, only a few months later, Russia threw out the United States Agency for International Development, which played a major role in funding civil society associations throughout Russia. The Russian government claimed that the agency's activities undermined Russia's sovereignty. A law adopted the next month, in October 2012, expanded the definition of treason to include, quote, providing financial, technical, advisory, or other assistance to a foreign state or international organization directed at harming Russia's security. But the law was so vague that many fear that it could be used for criminalizing involvement in international human rights advocacy. And in fact, it was passed precisely for that kind of purpose. In December 2012, Putin signed a law allowing the suspension of non-governmental organizations and the freezing of their assets if they engage in, quote, political activities and receive funding from the United States, citizens, organizations, or governments. Organizations can be similarly sanctioned if their leaders or members are Russian citizens who have U.S. passports. There happens to be a very famous Russian citizen who leads a human rights organization who is also an American citizen because she was forced out of the Soviet Union and then became an American citizen and then went back to Russia after the collapse of communism. That's Lyudmila Alexeyeva, who is the dean of the human rights community in Moscow. And many think that the law itself was aimed at silencing her. The law, which is probably better known, is a law that banned adoptions of Russians by U.S. citizens. It was passed in retaliation for the so-called Magnitsky Act, which President Obama signed into law in December. Magnitsky Act calls for visa bans or visas to the United States, and asset freezes if the assets are in the United States for Russian officials involved in torture and killing of corruption whistleblower Sergei Magnitsky and for others responsible for serious human rights violations. So those are the laws. In addition, over the past 10 months, we've witnessed an unprecedented crackdown on opposition activists and politicians in an attempt to silence the political opposition in Russia, with a significant number now behind bars, subject to criminal charges or police investigations, or in some cases beaten up on the streets. So most of you probably have heard of Pussy Riot, which was the feminist rock band, the three feminist rock musicians, who were sentenced to 2 years in a prison colony for their rock protest at Moscow's main cathedral. But there are many other cases. 12 people are behind bars today for allegedly hitting and pushing police at an otherwise peaceful rally in May 2012. They're charged with having engaged in mass riots and subject possibly to a 10-year prison sentence. One of the key opposition leaders, Sergei Udaltsov, is now confined to his home. He's under house arrest. And by court order, he is not allowed to have contact with anyone except members of his family and his lawyer and law enforcement representatives. He's prohibited from using the telephone, from using the internet, or from sending and receiving letters. Alexei Navalny, who was one of the leaders of the protest that took place last year in Russia, the anti-corruption blogger who inspired so many people to go out on the streets against electoral fraud, has been investigated with a dizzying array of charges. Supposedly, he is being investigated for stealing lumber, for fleecing a cosmetics company, for embezzling funds from a now-defunct political party, and for helping illegally to privatize a distillery. So none of these investigations have produced at all any evidence so far. And there's another opposition figure, Leonid Razvajayev, who's now accused of fomenting violence. He was kidnapped in Ukraine, where he had applied for political asylum, and forcibly returned to Russia, placed in prison, and forced to sign a confession under threats to his family. So you can see, and I could give many other examples. These are just illustrative examples. Putin 2.0 has been a severe constriction, contraction of the public sphere in Russia, and it has been a move towards a much more authoritarian version of the Russian regime than we've seen in a long time. Now let me give a little bit of background to this and why this is taking place. And of course, Putin 1.0 wasn't like that was a picnic, you know. It was also characterized by significant closing of the political system and human rights abuses. But Putin 1.0 still contained a sense of economic and social dynamism. It actually was a popular regime in many ways throughout its first presidency. This popularity was based largely on several factors. Putin's efforts to reconstitute the Soviet state after years of political and economic instability and social breakdown, and the economic growth that accompanied his rule throughout the early 2000s. So the 1990s in Russia are known today in Russia as the wild years, in which people's savings were wiped out overnight, crime skyrocketed, unemployment and inflation proliferated, Russian power abroad was in retreat, society was thrust into a deep level of insecurity. So what animated the Putin 1.0 presidency, more than anything else, was the desire to build back the Russian state after this period of collapse, to shed it of its characteristics of weakness that had occurred during the Yeltsin regime, the Yeltsin years, and to reassert state power at home and abroad. So Putin's biography, as you probably know, positioned him quite well for that. In particular, his early career as a professional spy. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Putin rose within the St. Petersburg administration when his boss, Anatoly Sobchak, was not reelected as mayor of St. Petersburg. Putin then moved to Moscow and got a job with the presidential administration in 1996. He soon won the support of powerful people because 2 years later, Putin was selected to become head of the FSB, which is the successor organization to the KGB. So he had a meteoric rise to the top. Then, 1 year later, he was chosen by Yeltsin to be his prime minister in 1999. So Yeltsin at that time was quite ill, and he announced actually shortly afterwards that he would like to have Putin as his successor as president. So there's still a lot we don't know about what happened when Putin became Yeltsin's successor, but here was a person who was practically plucked out of nowhere. The traditional political elite was overridden. Somebody who wasn't well known. And essentially, this person was made by the presidential apparatus into a candidate who, several months later, because of the ways in which things were manipulated, was able to win the election with 53% of the vote. So essentially, the selection of Putin as president was an act that kind of rode over the existing political elite. Now, Putin actually very quickly moved to consolidate his control. Early in the presidency, Putin 1.0, he called in the so-called oligarchs, that is, the super wealthy individuals who had made money by getting parts of the privatization of vast amounts of Soviet industry. He called in these oligarchs and told them flatly that if they didn't play by his rules, they wouldn't play. And that they would be out, he would harass them. And in fact, he did so with several of the key oligarchs who were there. In 2001, he went after Vladimir Businski, the owner of the main independent independent television station at the time, NTV. Shortly afterwards, he went after Boris Berezovsky, who was a close friend of the Yeltsin family, was rumored to actually have selected Putin in the first place, and to have played a role in the process of his rise. He's now in exile in London. And then when tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then the richest man in Russia, and owner of the giant Yukos oil company, started to finance liberal opposition parties, he was charged with tax fraud and sentenced to 9 years in prison. And his oil company was renationalized. So under Putin 1.0, the Russian state also asserted its control over key levers of the economy, particularly through the energy sector. In the meantime, Putin promoted a whole new group of people into the state, the so-called siloviki, as they're known, that is, people connected with the power ministries, in particular the secret police. So as many as 6,000 FSB officers moved into key government posts under Putin 1.0, and according to one study of the Russian elite, as of 2006, a quarter of the top 1,000 political figures in Russia had served at one point in time in the KGB or in its successor organizations. So under Putin 1.0, we know that a brutal war was carried out in Chechnya against separatists in Chechnya. The city of Grozny was bombed flat at the time. So-called filtration camps were set up to weed out the enemy. Putin placed local warlords in charge of Chechnya in order to assert control violently over the population. Acts of terrorism, however, continued to dominate Putin 1.0. And in 2004, the worst act took place in the town of Beslan in northern Ossetia, when a group of Chechen terrorists took 1,200 school children and teachers hostage on the opening day of school, actually teachers' parents and school children. They wired up the auditorium with bombs, and then when the Russian security forces stormed it, they set off the bombs, and 334 people died, 186 of them children. This was a transformative event within Russia that Putin utilized this event in order to assert his control. So one of the things he did at the time was to declare that no longer would Russian governors be elected. They would be appointed from the center. And so he asserted his control over the various territories of Russia and basically made Russian federalism a farce. Now, despite all of this, Putin, as I said, Putin 1.0 was wildly popular. From 2000 to 2008, Putin's popularity remained in the 60 to 80% approval rate within Russia. He spent a lot of effort managing public opinion through the media and through ensuring that the media was providing positive coverage. But to a large extent, this was driven by three forces, three factors. First of all, the economy. Secondly, stability. And thirdly, Russian nationalism. Since 1999 until 2008, Russia enjoyed, for the first time since the collapse of the USSR, an unprecedented economic boom. This was largely connected with the quadrupling of oil prices that took place at the time. Russia, as you know, is heavily dependent upon oil and natural gas exports. It makes it highly vulnerable to fluctuations in the price of oil and gas. According to the IMF, when the price of oil changes by $1 per barrel, then $3.4 billion flows into the Russian treasury. So that's how dependent it is on the price of oil. So this enormous rise in the price of oil allowed Russia to get rid of its debts. It had been one of the biggest debtor countries actually at the time, or earlier, but it got rid of its debts and was able to stabilize its government's operations. It also opened up the possibilities, though, for enormous corruption. And Putin 1.0 was known for enormous corruption. According to Transparency International, it's been ranked as one of the lowest in its rankings repeatedly for quite a long time, and continues to be today. It's a disease that penetrates throughout the Russian hierarchy, even up to the very top and even to Putin himself. So finally, Putin 1.0 also benefited from the sense of stability that Putin brought to Russia at the time, and also its assertion of Russian interests abroad. Putin had a much more aggressive foreign policy abroad. He touted Russia as a great power, particularly in the post-Soviet region and in its relations with other countries. So this was aimed at instilling a sense of pride among Russians. Now, when Putin decided not to have the two-term limit in the Russian Constitution amended, and he could have done that. He could have changed the Russian Constitution to get rid of the two-term limit. He decided instead to have this tandem of relationship with his aide, Dmitry Medvedev. But when he picked Medvedev as the person to take his place for 4 years and for him to become prime minister, he picked somebody who was incredibly weak, who had no power base within Russia. He was an aide of Putin's. He was dependent upon Putin. Even so, the Medvedev interlude seems today kind of like, I don't know, quite a nice period in certain respects in Russian history. Medvedev was able to put some personal imprint on the state. There was a subtly different aspect of policy. At the top of his agenda was the modernization of Russia. He wanted to lessen Russia's dependence upon oil and gas prices. Medvedev furthered the privatization of state assets. He launched a major anti-corruption campaign. He made technological innovation and the creation of a technological innovation center in Moscow, one of the main features of his program. He initiated substantial legal reform. He was by background, a lawyer. In foreign policy, he's associated with signing a New START treaty with the United States and the so-called reset. The reset of Russian-American relations, which was aimed at normalizing Russian-American relations after the 2008 Georgian War, when Russian-American relations had sunk to a low. Now, Putin seemed satisfied with all this, at least at first, or at least he gave leeway to Medvedev to pursue these policies. I think to do otherwise would have undermined the powers of the presidency that he himself wanted to occupy again. Moreover, during Medvedev's term in Russia, I should say the economy was hit by the global recession and took a significant dive. So it contracted by 7.8% in 2009 alone, although in recent years it's recovered relatively rapidly. So then, in September 2011, Medvedev announced that he would not seek a second term as president and instead endorsed Putin for president. And this was this sudden admission, in some ways, that the political system was being openly manipulated. And in fact, that the Medvedev presidency had been a farce for the past 4 years. Really incited a lot of anger against Putin. His popularity sunk tremendously over the course of 2011. And in December 2011, legislative elections occurred in Russia. The president's party, United Russia, received 49% of the votes. It was able, though, to turn that into 52% of the seats, so it still controls the majority in the legislature. But for the first time, you had an expression of the fact that it rules without popular support. It didn't get more than a majority of the popular support within the election. This 49% occurred despite the fact that there was tremendous falsification of the result. So all over Russia, but just to give you one glaring example, in the city of Moscow, public opinion polls had shown that Putin's party, United Russia, had received somewhere in the realm of about 30 to 35% of the vote. And this something that came out in multiple public opinion polls. When the vote was reported, Putin's party received 46%. So there are many, many documented cases of so-called carousel voting. Carousel voting is when people are bussed around from voting precinct to voting precinct by buses by the ruling party, voting many, many times. You know, they always say vote early and often. They follow that rule in Russia. Then there were ballot boxes that were stuffed with ballots, even before the voting started. Then there was, there were cases of openly visible stuffing of ballot boxes that were caught on camera. So just while the elections were happening, an election official just picked out a bunch of papers and just stuffed them into the ballot box. So there was one case of an election worker in St. Petersburg who was offered 70,000 rubles to, quote unquote, help United Russia by inflating its vote. She refused and she was fired. And there were other instances like that. Now, electoral fraud is nothing new in Russia. There's been significant electoral fraud pretty much in every election that's occurred in Russia since the mid-1990s. But what was different this time was the reaction of the public. In this case, this instance of significant electoral fraud set off the largest manifestation of protest, of public protest, in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. From December 2011 to March 2012, protests occurred in hundreds of cities in Russia, though only in Moscow did they really gain a large significance. In Moscow, 110,000 citizens participated in some of the largest protests that occurred, 120. These protests were against electoral fraud. So what had happened? Why did people protest in this case and not in another case? Well, one thing was Putin's declining popularity. So this was a much more contested situation. But more importantly, Russian society had changed over the course of the 2000s. Over the course of the 2000s, which was an unprecedented decade of prosperity and the growth of a new middle class, you had the emergence of a whole new group of people who were savvy, people who were well-traveled. Russians vacation abroad these days fairly easily. This began to emerge in Russia and in a few other of the major urban centers, besides Moscow. So emerged in Moscow and a few other major urban centers. So if you go to central Moscow today, one of the things that you notice are the signs of wealth, of newfound wealth. So you have well-dressed men and women, you have an explosion of restaurants, quite good restaurants, coffee houses, you have ubiquitous BMWs, and you have what I consider to be the most overt, ultimate expression of disposable income, and that is nail salons. Sorry, ladies, nail salons are the ultimate expression of disposable income. But they are there now in central Moscow, nail salons. So in 2012, the average monthly wage of a Moscow resident was double the national average. Double the national average, and it had been rapidly growing over the course of the previous decade. Public opinion polls of those who participated in the protests showed that they were overwhelmingly educated, middle-aged, and significantly better off than the Moscow population as a whole. Over 60% of those who participated in the protests had a higher education. That's astounding. That's compared to about 25% of the population of Moscow and about 15% of the, 16% of the Russian population over the age of 16. So many of them had never been involved in politics before. They were mobilized in politics for the first time. So this was a new phenomenon that occurred as a result of the growing prosperity of Russia over the past decade. And this relates to the other way in which Russia had fundamentally changed, and that was the internet. So over the latter part of the 2000s, Russia had become one of the most socially networked societies in the world. at an astounding pace. So today, 12.3% of all internet users in Russia are located inside the Russian Federation. That's 1 out of every 8 internet users in Europe are located inside of Russia. 62 million people who are the largest internet community actually in Europe today, outside of Germany. But by the beginning of 2012, half of Russia's population used the internet. Moreover, 75% of Russia's internet users use the internet to engage in online social networking. And studies show that Russians are some of the heaviest online social networkers worldwide in terms of the number of hours that they spend per month on, not Facebook, they have their equivalent of Facebook, but some spend on Facebook, but there are several other versions. So Russians spend twice as many hours on social networks than do Americans. Now you wonder what they're doing in the rest of the day, but this is a fact. They spend more time on social networks, much more time on social networks than do Americans. Blogs and social networking sites played conspicuous roles in exposing electoral fraud during this period, particularly the combination of cell phones and internet, which is a potent combination around the world these days, that is using the cell phone as a video camera, uploading it, and they captured fraud of it. All these incidents that I just told you about, all pretty much were documented by cell phone and internet combination. So in short, just like in the Middle East, where the rise of the internet created a new public sphere that was destabilizing, in Russia as well, in the course of a very short period of time, this internet grew only over the course of a couple of years. You had the emergence of this new public sphere that helped to destabilize Russia. Now, if there was any set of events that has helped to shape the character of 2.0, it was these protests. And the reaction to these protests. The protesters who called for Putin's resignation and for new elections to be held represented the entire spectrum of Russia, of public opinion in Russia. They included liberals, predominantly liberals, but they also included communists, and they included nationalists, and they included anarchists, and from the entire political spectrum. The only people they didn't include were the Putinites. So some establishment politicians even defected to the opposition at the time. Some very prominent establishment politicians defected to the opposition. And many people I spoke with in the opposition thought Putin was over. Putinism was over. They were convinced of it. But instead, the reaction of the regime at the time was to give a few concessions, a few reforms. They lifted restrictions on registrations of political parties. They allowed competitive elections for governor and things like that. And then the combination of that plus the repressive measures that I've talked about have been able to subdue the protests. But these protests truly scared Putin, as they should. The type of discourse that was happening at the time. The thrust of almost everything that Putin has done in Putin 2.0 has been oriented against these protests, to clamp down on this opposition, to undermine the basis of support of the opposition, to isolate the opposition, to isolate it internationally, to isolate it domestically. So almost all of the political reforms that the government talked about and enacted in 2012 have now been done away with already. Last month, Russian lawmakers gave preliminary approval to a law that would allow governors once again to be appointed by the president. So basically, competitive elections lasted about 1 year. Moreover, Putin is now in the process of enacting further reforms to the electoral law. The biggest aspect of these reforms, these proposed reforms, are new prohibitions against the promotion or impediment to the organization of elections or the nomination of registration of candidates or to the elections themselves, any attempt to influence that by foreign citizens or organizations. international organizations, including restrictions on electoral monitoring by foreigners. And this was one of the critical things that he wanted. He wanted to try to separate off electoral monitoring so that he could engage in fraud once again with impunity. So Putin is now left ruling over an intelligentsia that openly mocks him. And the gulf between state and society has become widened and I would say unresolvably unreachable. Irreparably reached. So Putin no longer enjoys much of any personal legitimacy within Russian society. When he first became president in 2000, he was, of course, 47 years old. At the time, the same age as Obama was when he became president. I doubt many of you know the Russian pop song, techno-pop hit in 2002. In Russian, it was Takovo Kak Putin, which means I want to be a man like Putin. Or excuse me, I want to be a man like Putin. Takovo Kak Putin. It was performed over and over again at various Putin campaign rallies at the time. The song was meant to elevate Putin into a sex symbol and to further project his image of virility. As you know, he's very concerned about his image of virility. So the words of the song went like this: I want a man like Putin, full of strength, who won't be a drunk, who wouldn't hurt me, who wouldn't run away. So I won't sing it for you. But you know, as most of you know, he's done all sorts of things during his presidency to prove his manliness. So he has, consorted with tigers. He's driven jets and tanks, and he dove for buried treasure. Amazing that he found these ancient Greek amphoras at the bottom of the sea. When he pulled them up, they were totally clean, as if his latest antic, which he carried out in October to revive his cult of manliness, was when he clad himself in white coveralls, and he rode a hang glider. He tried to lead a group of endangered cranes south for the winter. But I should say, most of the cranes did not follow him, which became a symbol and part of jokes that were widely circulated, of course, all over the internet in Russia. So the point is that Putin 2.0 has lost its dynamism, its sexiness, its manliness. In some ways, he is trying to recapture this sense of dynamism that was there in Putin 1.0, but it cannot be recaptured. It is lost. He rules by controlling the levers of the state, its ability to reward and to punish. The memories of the wild 1990s, the instability of the 1990s, are becoming farther and farther away, and less the reference point that serves to underpin his regime. And public opinion polls show that the number of Russians who trust Putin has fallen to about a third of Russian society. It's not insignificant, but it's still pretty low compared to the earlier years of Putin 1.0. So it's here where Putin 2.0 has turned to nationalism and to a strident nationalism as a way to try to shore up the regime. So at his State of the Nation speech this past December, Putin made preservation of, quote, national and spiritual identity as the centerpiece of his speech. He sought to institutionalize a new nationalism, a new Russian nationalism that promotes patriotism and the moral foundations of Russian society. Part of this has involved a strong alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, I should say the Russian Patriarch Kirill I has called Putin a miracle. I agree that he did. And has been in an alliance with Putin over the last year. Supported his election. He criticized the protesters in Moscow severely. There has been a nationwide ban on engaging in promoting homosexual propaganda in Russia to minors that the regime has passed. It's kind of exemplary of the kinds of laws that the church would like to see, but also fanning a kind of nationalism that's there. Putin's Minister of Culture, a man named Vladimir Medinsky, is well known for his attacks on what he calls Russophobia within the writing of history. His version of Russophobia includes attacks on Stalin and what Stalin did, and any discussions of anti-Semitism in Russia. So this is where Putin's strident anti-Americanism comes in as well. At the time of the December 2011 protest, the Russian authorities accused the United States and personally accused Hillary Clinton of being behind the protests. My colleague Mike McFadden, a good friend of mine who's the ambassador in Moscow, and was one of the architects of the Russian reset, has been accused by the Russian government of having been sent to Russia in order to foment revolution. I should say that even before the December protests, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction in Russia with the so-called reset. Other than Russian accession to the WTO, many in the Russian elite felt that the United States achieved a lot more through the reset than did Russia. Since 2009, for instance, NATO was able to support its supply routes to Afghanistan through Russia, through Russian airspace. Russia has been stymied in its attempts to control and to roll back U.S. plans for anti-missile installations in Eastern Europe. Russia has been angry over NATO intervention in Libya and over the instability in the Middle East, which it sees as an attempt to extend American influence in the region. And it has failed to gain any U.S. recognition for what is its ultimate strategic goal, at least in the short term, and that is expanding its control over the post-Soviet states in its immediate neighborhood. Now, as part of its efforts to reduce the foreign footprint in Russia, in October, Putin canceled Russia's participation in the Non-Lugar Act. The Non-Lugar Act was one of the cornerstones of the post-Cold War order. Basically, it's been there since 1991, it aimed to reduce Russia's arsenal of nuclear and chemical weapons, to dismantle them, biological weapons, to dismantle them and safely store them after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia pulled unilaterally out of that agreement. Then in December, the Magnitsky Act brought anti-Americanism to new heights within the Russian government, with, as I mentioned before, the banning of adoptions from Russia by American citizens in retaliation. Suddenly, American meat imports were found to be tainted with a terrible chemical. I don't know if you've been eating it. That was considered to also have been an act of retaliation, so that these meat imports were banned. And then, since December, Duma legislatures have each tried to outdo each other in anti-American proposals. I mean, it's just been kind of crazy. So there's been a proposal, for instance, to regulate movie theaters, to make sure that movie theaters are not allowed to show just Hollywood movies, that they have to show at least 1/8 of all the movies they show have to be produced inside Russia. And so that, is one of many, many, many types of proposals that fall into this new nationalism that has emerged. At a recent speech before the FSB, the secret police, Putin called on security officers to shield Russians from an array of threats, including, quote, any direct or indirect interference in our internal affairs, any form of pressure on Russia from Russia's allies or partners. Significantly, he also announced at the meeting that he was raising their salaries by 40%. So it seems doubtful that this kind of nationalism and this kind of xenophobia is going to be able to attract the kind of foreign investment that would be necessary to really wean Russia from its dependence on oil prices, to create a vibrant level of economic growth. The words about modernization that had been talked about during the Medvedev period now aren't even mentioned. And it's unlikely to stem the enormous flight of capital out of Moscow, out of Russia. So $40 billion a year leaves the Russian economy every year. Putin recently submitted a bill to the Duma banning public officials and lawmakers from having foreign bank accounts or investing in foreign government debt. He is going to require them to declare all the property that they own abroad. This sent ripples within the elite who feared this. And in fact, it caused, after an internet revelation, it caused the head of the Duma's ethics committee, a man named Vladimir Pektin, to resign. It turns out that he has a $1.3 million luxury apartment in Miami that he didn't want to give up. And so he chose Miami over Moscow. And maybe it was a good choice. But there's now a new verb in Russia, and that is to pekting somebody. That is to reveal the hidden assets that a Russian legislator or official has over the internet, thereby causing a scandal. So this has now become quite popular. Corruption still remains very widespread within Russia. Recently it was revealed that Russia's 2014 Winter Olympics will cost close to $50 billion. That's almost 4 times the cost of London's 2012 Summer Olympics, and 7 times the cost of the 2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics. And to give you some idea of where the money is being spent, $8.6 billion was spent on building 30 miles of road between Sochi and various facilities. So enormous amount of waste and corruption. So to sum up, Putin 2.0 is very much of an inward-looking enterprise. It's obsessed with issues of instability, opposition, and containing foreign influence. It's going to remain stable, likely, because I don't think the opposition is going to have another major opportunity to assert itself until the next round of elections, which won't be for another 4 years. So. But it's also clear that Russian politics will not go back to what it was. It can't go back to Putin 1.0. Putin 2.0 is a completely different animal. The relationship between the Putin regime and Russian society has been irreparably breached. It is very wide. It can't be repaired. And that will have effects on the governing style of Putin. It makes it very difficult for him to open things up in that kind of situation. And in terms of Russian-U.S. relations, they've pretty much hit rock bottom again. And one can expect that they're going to stay that way for quite a while until Putin feels secure enough to be able to accept some kind of relationship. I should say, even though this reset is dead, really Russia has become much less relevant for the United States in many ways over time. So with the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the United States doesn't need that strategic airspace anymore to supply its troops in Afghanistan. In fact, I would say the reaction of the Obama administration to all of this has largely been to ignore it, not to do something in retaliation for the retaliation and so on, to be engaged in a tit for tat, which I think has been the wise approach, not to get into a cycle of back and forth, but rather to ignore it in some ways, to criticize it. Perhaps it could be criticized a little bit more publicly, but at the same time, to take countermeasures would probably only be inciting it and to actually play into the hands of this countermeasures. Thank you. So I think I have some time for questions if you have any. Yeah.
You compared Putin to Stalin earlier in the start of your talk. Does Putin have a elementary gun?
No. And the comparison to Stalin was really only in years ruling Russia, you know, Stalin was and Stalinism was a completely different thing. So Putinism is what we might call an electoral authoritarianism. It's a soft authoritarianism. You know, it's repressive. It manipulates elections to stay in power. In some ways, though, the fact that it even goes through the farce of elections shows that it pays some attention to international norms about, you know, popular self-determination. Stalinism was a completely different animal. It was a strict dictatorship with a much larger cult of personality, with millions of people dying. And so it's a completely different phenomenon. But, you know, part of the varied experience, the Russian experience with authoritarianism. I think the only comparison really is the longevity. I should say, though, that Putin has tried to resuscitate Stalin as an historical figure. So this is also is part of the nationalism that's there. And Stalin actually, ironically, well, he's surprisingly popular within the Russian population. There isn't the kind of open discussion, you know, of Stalin's crimes as you now get, let's say, within Germany about what happened in Nazi Germany. Because Nazi Germany didn't talk about it for a long period of time, but now it's pretty openly spoken about. But that discussion, really in Russia, you know, it took place during the Glasnost period and fell off. It's never, and the textbooks that have been written and are being rewritten as we talk are downplaying stuff. Yes?
It seems that a lot of Russia's international alliances are continuations of former Soviet client states. Is there any way that Putin's foreign policy diverges from the old Soviet foreign policy?
Well, Russia no longer is a global power, so it really doesn't have ambitions to spread its influence that far beyond its immediate borders. It did have some client states in the Middle East, particularly Syria. I think it's just not, it doesn't like to see American influence spread within what it sees as its sphere of influence, that is, its sphere of influence being the post-Soviet region and its immediate area, contiguous area. So when Georgia you know, applied for NATO membership, that angered Russia tremendously. And Russia, Russia is content, I think, to have client relationships between itself and the post-Soviet republics, not to occupy them or to reincorporate them. The idea is not to recreate the Soviet Union. I don't think that that's a likely goal, but it is to have a kind of informal imperial structure that is one in which these states are so tied to Russia, and they are heavily dependent upon Russia, and they always have been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. To keep them tied to Russia, dependent upon Russia, and therefore to assert Russia's power in its immediate neighborhood. So it doesn't have ambitions to compete on a global scale with the United States in the same way that the Soviet Union did. Yeah.
Who are Putin's friends in the international world, and what is the nature of those relationships?
So aside from some of the countries in the immediate post-Soviet era, well, you know, although Russia and China have always had somewhat of a testy relationship, they have teamed up together to try to contain American power on certain occasions. Russia has reached out to Hugo Chavez, you know, yeah, he just passed away. You know, to basically those who I would say seek to contain American influence. Now, Russia also is, but at the same time, is very tied into Europe. So it is the main gas supplier and oil supplier in Europe. Its profits on the oil market are largely coming out of Europe. And so Russia, to some extent, has tried to play off the United States and Europe. I wouldn't say that it has great friends within Western Europe, but it also is careful not to incite opinion within Western Europe. You know, other friends, it doesn't have close friends. It has, again, with Iran, has tried to contain American influence in the area, and that was true in Libya as well. So it really sees itself, you know, although it's not able to project its power, go beyond its boundaries, it still kind of plays that Cold War game to some extent, at least diplomatically. It just doesn't have the ability to really defend its interests anywhere outside of its immediate sphere. Yes?
You mentioned that Putin has a roughly 30% approval rate. Who is in that?
Trust.
Excuse me?
30%, about 30% trust Putin.
So who was in that group?
Who is in the 30%?
Yeah.
It tend to be older people, working class people, people in the provinces, not in major urban areas, certainly not the highly educated people. People, you know, there have been some very interesting studies that have shown that one of the ways in which Putin controls the electoral system is through his control of enterprises and the relationship between the regime and enterprises. So many enterprise directors actually mobilize the workers at their enterprises to vote, and to vote for Putin. So, you know, again, it's often very hard to know what the degree of support is within the population and how soft it actually is. There have been studies, focus group studies, that argue that it actually is very, very soft and it could collapse. I don't think it's quite soft as they Yes?
I looked at the approval ratings for the U.S. Congress and
Yes.
that kind of thing, and you don't know really what it means other than if there is the opposition being organized. And it doesn't sound like the opposition to Putin is coalesced in a cohesive way. Is that right?
It didn't, and that was one of the big mistakes of the opposition. You know, it's very hard to topple a regime when you decide to meet once a month and you go on vacation over the summer, which is what this opposition did. It actually represented a pretty broad spectrum of opinion across the political spectrum, but it never kind of broke through that barrier. In order to, if the goal really was to overthrow Putin, 100,000 is not sufficient. 300,000 is what, you know, I study protests. You have to get up to that range in order to really start to shake the regime. They started to get some defections from the regime. This was a sign that there was significant lack of consensus within the Russian elite itself. But a lot of people are scared to go on the street or wouldn't do it.
It's not a single party.
It's not a single party. It's very fragmented. And it was also, a lot of it was mobilized over the internet. And so that's even less organized. You know, that's people who are following particular blogs. So one of the problems of internet mobilization in general, and this is true around the world, is that it undermines political organization. The kind of traditional political organization that is often used, you know, as the basis for overthrowing the regime. Sometimes you can get a lot of people to come out in a moment, for a short period of time. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't give you the kind of political organization to be able to really organize that opinion in any way. And even if you do overthrow the regime, as we've seen in Egypt, you know, you cede the field to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. So, because if you're not organized, you know, the internet population is not organized in the same way. So it has had some effects on the political process. Yeah.
How much of a role is Russia playing in the Syrian conflict?
They've been supplying weapons to the Syrian government. They, of course, have been vociferously protesting against any effort to interfere in Syria by anyone but themselves. And so, and have vetoed, have prevented any action at the United Nations from taking place. So they've been heavily involved with the Syrian regime. There have been some signs at times that they might back off from that. What are the interests of Russia in Syria? Well, really not that much. I mean, they have a refueling station on the Mediterranean in Syria, but it's not that important. And I think for Russia, again, it's a matter of competition, seeing itself in competition. So Russia is more of a spoiler, in a sense. It can't project its power. It can't project its power abroad. But it can spoil other people's actions either by vetoing or supplying weapons or making it more difficult for coalitions to form. Yes?
Yeah, though you talk about opposition, you haven't talked so much about the media and Putin's relationship to the media, who seem to be people to whom I would not sell life insurance. Talking about that.
About the media. Sure. Well, the media already has been censored. I mean, in many parts of the media, particularly television, has been censored for a long time. Which is why, of course, the internet has become so popular as a source of news in Russia. So, 25% of Russians get their news from the internet because television is not trustworthy. Now, there are publications in Russia that are fairly open and critical of Putin. Not many of them, but there are some. So it's not like the public sphere has been totally squashed. But television, which is the main source that people utilize to get news, has been very much censored. So part of his battles with the oligarchs was basically those battles were over television coverage of the Putin administration. He was able to reallocate those television stations to people who were more reliable and who know that their control over those resources is dependent upon the way in which they cover the president. So there doesn't need to be necessarily an overt censorship, although sometimes there is. But we'll just know what the limits are. Yeah, yes?
What are the lessons for Turkey from the Arab Spring?
So a few lessons, and I think he has learned some of those lessons. So one lesson has to do with this public sphere, this new public sphere. He can't let it go entirely and ignore it. So the Russian approach to dealing with the internet prior to the 2011-2012 protests was to surveil it, but not to censor it. And so it's clear that that's not going to work. So that's certainly one lesson that I should say he learned from the Arab Spring. There are a lot of differences between Russia and the Arab Spring. In the case of the Arab Spring, you had a regime which was totally devoid of any kind of popular support. It totally hollowed out over the years. Putinism could evolve in that direction. As I said, right now, I think there's this irreproachable breach, irreparable breach between the public and the regime. And I think, ultimately, he's going to have to figure out some way to at least maintain a significant level of popular support. Unless he also, realizes that it does take a lot of people to overthrow the government. he also realizes that foreign connections are important in that process. So it was not necessarily true in the Tunisian case, but it was certainly true in the Egyptian case. The role that the American government played in the process was critical. The role that international media played in that process was also critical. So I mean, he's moving in those directions to try to contain those influences. I don't know if those are the only lessons, but those are certainly some. May we thank Professor Bryce?